This episode is brought to you by Squarespace. What's going on, you guys? Welcome back to yet another King Japes episode. Now today, you guys, we're going to be talking about my experience with some of the older Fujifilm cameras. Those three cameras in particular are the x100s, the Xpro2, and my camera at the moment, the Xpro2. Now, at the time of filming this episode, each of these cameras have been updated recently by Fuji. And so, these cameras are now considered old. And the reason why I would like to, kind of make this video is because I feel like these cameras are still a great way to get into the Fujifilm system at a much more affordable price point. Alright, so let's get started with the first camera that I own from Fujifilm, my gateway getting into it, the Fujifilm X100s. Now, the X100s was the second version of the X100 that initially came out. And the X100s is a 16.3 megapixel rangefinder styled fixed lens camera. And so the lens on that was a 23mm f2, which is equivalent to a 35mm lens. Now, I adored the X100s. It was one of my favorite cameras at the time of picking it up, which was in like 2018. And I used that thing for street photography like crazy. And the overall aesthetic of it was very, very much reminiscent of shooting with a rangefinder camera, which I absolutely enjoyed because at that time I had the Voigtlander Bessa R2A and my Leica M2. And so having those cameras alongside the X100s, it all really felt very similar. Now, a couple of pros and a couple of cons about the X100s. Let's start off with the pros. First and foremost, it had 16.3 megapixels, which was more than enough to do any social media work here on YouTube, Instagram, Twitter, whatever it is. It had enough resolution to print up to 12 by 18. And, I had no real complaints about the image quality. It had a nice 23mm f2 lens, which was exceptionally sharp. No complaints there either. But the two things that I really did complain about the X100s was the autofocus. The autofocus wasn't atrocious, but it wasn't as responsive as I wanted it to be. Also, because I was trying to use that as a street photography camera, I needed something that was going to be responsive enough for me to capture moments out on the street. Secondly, the battery life wasn't all that great. You would go through a battery in an hour if you were just walking around the city. And so I ended up selling the X100s for the second camera that I've owned from Fujifilm, the Fujifilm Xpro2. Really quick, before we talk about the Xpro2, a quick shout out to our sponsor for this episode, the good folks over at Squarespace. Squarespace is your all-in-one platform to build a beautiful online presence and run your business. Now, if you're looking to build your own dedicated professional photography website, Squarespace has you covered. I personally made my website through Squarespace, and the process was super simple. To get started, choose an award-winning template that you can use to get started in minutes, and then select your different pages and features. For example, I have features on my website like the gallery and portfolio page where I show off my street photography and my portfolio, as well as an online store to sell prints. And one of the newest features here on Squarespace, a dedicated space to show your videos. So you can post your teasers, your samples of your video work, or even just your YouTube videos. So if you want to get started with your own personalized website, head over to squarespace.com/kingjapes or enter promo code kingjapes at checkout to receive 10% off of your first purchase of a domain or a website. Huge thank you to Squarespace for sponsoring this episode. Now, at this point, the Xpro2 has a huge cult following. It's the cheapest Xpro out of the lineup, and it's also available on the used markets every single day for a pretty penny. So anywhere between $400, $300 to $400, you can find Xpro2s used on eBay. Now, with that said, the Xpro2 has very similar specs to the X100s. 16.3 megapixels. I believe at that time you also had the same film presets built into them because they were, the same generation of camera. And the only reason why I wanted a Xpro camera instead of the X100s camera was because I wanted to be able to change focal lengths. And so when I got the Xpro2, I ended up having the 27mm f2, which was a great little lens, pancake 40mm lens, as well as the 7 Artisans 25mm 1.8. So now that I had the Xpro2, the ability to change focal lengths was honestly really fun. I was able to shoot with the 40mm lens when I wanted to, but if I wanted to go wider, I can go with the 25mm lens. I'm not going to really go over into the specs of the Xpro2, but very similar to the shape and body of this one here. This is the Xpro2. But for some reason, you guys, the Xpro2 ended up being the camera that I didn't like. It just for some reason wasn't clicking with me with the way I worked, and also just the rear LCD. None of my photographs on the LCD looked good. And it was weird coming from an X100s where all of my photographs were sharp. Autofocus was, not that great, but it still caught focus. Moving over to the Xpro 1, I always expected that, I would be able to capture, amazing photographs, maybe even better because I can change lenses. That wasn't the case for me. I don't know if it was my copy. I really, really wanted to like that camera. But at the end of the day, after a couple of months of using it, I ended up selling it because I just wasn't satisfied. Now, I knew though that I wanted something similar to the Xpro 1. And at that time, the Xpro2 had just gotten released. And so a lot of people were selling off their Xpro2s, the predecessor. And I ended up purchasing, actually, I didn't purchase the Xpro2. I traded a camera for the Xpro2. Now, I got the Xpro2 in a trade with a 23mm f2 lens for my Nikon 35 Ti point and shoot film camera. And that camera was great, but I ended up, letting it go because I never really shot with it. It was too pretty to get out with and, kind of bang around and damage. I wanted something that I can get a lot more use of. And the Xpro2 came out of that trade. And my gosh, this camera, even though it's not the newest model, is amazing. Now the Xpro2 has a slightly more updated sensor than the Xpro 1 and X100s, 24 megapixels. That's all you really need nowadays. It's more than enough to print large, as well as just post on social media. And also the autofocus in this camera is surprisingly quick. It's not the fastest, it's not Sony fast like my a7 III that I'm filming on, but it's definitely more than enough to hit the streets and catch focus 9 times out of 10. Now with that said, the Xpro2 came with the newer presets. And a lot of them were like classic chrome. You have acros built into here, you have Astia. And the Xpro2 was everything that I wanted the Xpro 1 to be. Photographs, after looking into the rear LCD display, looked nice and sharp. Everything looked good. I was able to adjust, the different film presets that I had built into here to kind of tailor it to, what I needed it to look like. I'm showing you guys some photographs here on the screen as I'm talking of kind of like my Portra 400 film recipe. If you guys want to see an episode on that, definitely let me know. But paired with the 23mm f2, this camera has been with me everywhere, from the streets of San Francisco all the way to doing some professional client work with this camera. And folks, keep in mind, the only lens that I have ever had for the Xpro2 is this one right here, the 23mm f2. Given that it's a 35mm focal length, it's absolutely perfect for what I do. When I make family portraits, this is the lens that I shoot with. When I do things for like parties and whatnot, I'll generally pair this with a more wide angle lens from my Sony. So I'll have like the 17-28 on my Sony, and I'll have this, to do more kind of intimate portrait-esque work. As a matter of fact, recently doing an engagement shoot, this was the camera that I went for. And so, it goes to show that the quality in the images is there. The autofocus is still fast enough to be able to photograph out on the street. And being a couple of years old, I know this is not a full review. The Xpro2 honestly is one of the best values out on the market today. And if you can pick one of these up, I think you would not be disappointed. They go for less than the Xpro3. And if you're not sure about, forking out the money for a brand new Xpro3, to kind of get a feel for the Xpro system, the Xpro2 is going to give you a really similar feel to the Xpro3. So even though my experience with Fujifilm cameras is limited, I do think they are great starter cameras, at least the 3 that I have, talked about in this video, the X100s, the Xpro 1, and Xpro2. But if I were to recommend 2 of those cameras, it would definitely be the X100s. Nowadays, even, some of the more updated models like the X100T or the X100F, those cameras are selling for a lot less than the newest one, which I believe is the V. You can also get the Xpro2, used on eBay for a pretty good price. And if you guys want to try out the Xpro 1, I would highly recommend you guys try that yourselves. I know a lot of people have been getting amazing results, and they've never had the urge to upgrade their Xpro 1 to even the Xpro 2. So like I said, it could have just been my copy, but that is my kind of overall experience on older Fujifilm cameras. A couple of things though that I want to mention before I leave here. I do really want to try out like an X-T2 or an X-T1. So if you guys know where I can pick one of those up for a good deal, let me know in the comment section down below. So if you guys have any experience on any of the gear that was just mentioned, leave those in the comment section down below. But I'll see you guys in the next one, man. As always, this has been King Japes. Till next time, Minolta Gang.